Forget the sanitized history books for a moment. Forget what you think you know about cruelty. Because today, we're plunging into the absolute darkest depths of human depravity, to a time when death wasn't just an end, it was a performance, a deliberate masterpiece of prolonged, excruciating terror. When you hear about having molten gold poured down your throat, or the unthinkable agony of being kicked around like a broken doll by an elephant fitted with razor-sharp blades, you might think it's just the stuff of Hollywood nightmares. But I promise you, reality was far, far worse. The devil's siren song, the brazen bull. Imagine this. You're trapped inside a magnificent, life-size bull statue, casting gleaming bronze. It looks like a work of art, but it's a terrifying oven. Beneath you, a roaring fire is being stoked. You're not just being cooked alive. That's too simple. The absolute sickness of this invention, known as a brazen bull, was the acoustics. Tubes, ingeniously and diabolically placed within the statue, were designed to transform your screams, your agonizing, desperate howls, into the melodious, sorrowful sound of a bull bellowing. And the man who condemned you? He would sit, listening, rejoicing in the music of your suffering. Could anything be more utterly twisted? The story of this hellish device is recorded in the works of the ancient Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, specifically in his massive 40-book series, Bibliotheca Historica. He documented it as a genuine method of capital punishment. In essence, the prisoner was sealed inside this bronze behemoth. As the fire beneath intensified, the metal would heat, eventually roasting the person within. The sound tubes ensured that the victim's final moments were not just felt by them, but heard and enjoyed by the executioner. The tyrannical mind behind the first recorded use of this monstrosity was a man named Phalaris, a ruler of the island we now call Sicily, presiding over his domain from roughly 570 to 554 BC. Phalaris wasn't just cruel, he was a legend of barbarism, reportedly indulging in acts of cannibalism for pleasure. The sculptor who actually crafted this instrument of doom was an Athenian artisan named Perillus. When Perillus presented the bull to the baby-eating tyrant, he highlighted his acoustic innovation. He supposedly bragged to Phalaris that, through the pipes, the victim's cries would reach the tyrant's ears as the tenderest, most pathetic, most melodious of bellowing. Now, Phalaris was a man who appreciated genius, but he hated a show-off. His reaction was pure, cold-blooded cunning. He smiled and said to the proud sculptor, "Excellent, Perillus. You must be the first to demonstrate its functionality. Go inside and imitate the sound for me so I can truly understand your device's operation." Perillus, perhaps terrified, perhaps just foolishly obedient, climbed in. Phalaris, without hesitation, lit the fire himself. He wanted to hear the music. Before the sculptor was fully dead, Phalaris had him pulled out, sparing the device from being soiled. But the act of mercy was a trap. Perillus was then dragged to a nearby cliff and thrown to his death. The tyrant wanted his pristine bronze bull to remain spotless. While some modern scholars argue that the brazen bull might have been nothing more than ancient propaganda, a horrifying tale designed to illustrate the monstrous nature of tyrants like Phalaris, the Roman statesman and philosopher Cicero certainly treated it as real. In his Verrine orations, he referenced the noble bull of Phalaris, which, the most cruel of all tyrants, was accustomed to put men for punishment and to put fire under. Given the other unthinkable tortures that were undeniably real, it's chillingly plausible that someone, somewhere, was indeed roasted alive in a bronze bowl. The penalty of the sack, a drowning with companions. If the brazen bull was a question mark in history, our next method is a bold, terrifying certainty. This one wasn't a legend, it was Roman law. We're talking about ponicolae, literally the penalty of the sack. Originally, in its simplest form, around 100 or 200 BC, this may have just involved tying a condemned person into a leather sack and tossing them into a body of water. A horrible death, yes, but the Romans, ever the innovators, ramped up the sadism.
This punishment was almost exclusively reserved for one crime: patricide or parricide, the act of murdering one's father or parent. In the Roman worldview, killing a parent wasn't just a crime. It was an act so monstrous, so fundamentally unnatural, that it polluted the entire world and caused the gods to turn away. The punishment, therefore, had to be equally horrifying. The ritual was specific and drawn out. The beating. The condemned was first brutally beaten with rods. The hood and clogs. Their head was covered with a hood made of wolfskin, and wooden shoes, a grim precursor to the mafia cement shoes, were fitted to their feet. The sack, while heavily bleeding, was sewn into a large sack crafted from ox leather. And the menagerie. And here's the pièce de résistance. As the victim lay trapped, living animals were thrown in with them. This was typically a disturbing collection that could include a dog, a monkey, a snake, and a cock, a rooster, or any combination thereof. The sack, now containing a terrified, bleeding person and a confused, violently panicking group of animals, was loaded onto a car and driven to the nearest river or pond. It was then unceremoniously dumped into the water. The victim wouldn't just drown. They would spend their final claustrophobic minutes fighting, clawing, and being lacerated and tortured by the desperate animals in an enclosed space, all while the water steadily rushed in. According to the historian Cicero, who ironically would later be beheaded himself, this incredibly complex method was actually rooted in a bizarre philosophical necessity. The crime of patricide, he argued, was so foul that the killer's very being would contaminate nature. You couldn't simply kill him and let his blood touch the ground. You couldn't just throw him into the sea without the sack, or his body would pollute the water. You couldn't even feed him to the beasts lest the animals become contaminated. The sack was the necessary barrier, a twisted way of separating the condemned from the natural world he had so grievously offended. The Roman historian Livy recounts a case where a man named Marcus Publicus Maliculus suffered this fate after killing his mother. Though some accounts suggest he was spared the animal element, the clogs and the sack were his end. This wasn't a rare, one-off event. It was codified into their legal structures, appearing in laws like Lex Pompeia and Lex Cornelia. Seneca the Younger even wrote that Emperor Claudius was so fond of this execution that he was ordering more pone caulae than crucifixions. Even as late as the 4th century AD, Emperor Constantine reconfirmed this brutal practice, writing in a letter that a parricide will not be punished by the sword, by fire, or by some other ordinary form of execution, but he will be sewn up in a sack, and in this dismal prison have serpents as his companions. And the horror didn't stop with the fall of Rome. The punishment, in modified forms, resurfaced in the 14th century Germany, and there's evidence suggesting that it occurred as late as the 18th. In a documented German case, the sack split when it hit the water, allowing the accompanying dog and cat to swim away while the man drowned alone. A minor difference perhaps, but a gruesome end nonetheless. The glutton's punishment, molten gold. Could there be a more profound, symbolic, and utterly agonizing way to execute a person consumed by greed than by forcing them to literally swallow the object of their desire? The idea of pouring molten metal down a victim's throat has appeared in fiction, most notably Game of Thrones, but the inspiration came from genuine, if disputed, historical accounts. One of the most famous tales involves the 16th century Spanish conquistador Pedro de Valdivia. Engaged in battle against the indigenous Mapuche people of Chile, Valdivia suffered a massive defeat. He tried to escape on horseback, but was captured after his horse became mired in a marsh. Taken back to the Mapuche leaders, his death was inevitable. While some sources claim he merely had his heart ripped out and consumed by his captors, another account, provided by a fellow conquistador, Pedro Mariño de Lovera, states that the Mapuche poured molten gold down his throat. This wasn't just a murder, it was a potent symbolic act, a final, lethal taste of the gold that drove his conquest. Scientists who have contemplated this grim scenario suggest that, while dramatically agonizing, the end would be swift. The rush of molten metal would instantly vaporize surrounding tissue. The resulting steam and the catastrophic thermal injury would rupture the lungs, leading to instant death from shock and pulmonary failure within seconds. As for the gold, once the victim was dead, the metal would solidify, making it easily recoverable, a morbidly efficient process. This wasn't just the spontaneous vengeance of a conquered people, though. Emperor Constantine again features in the dark history of justice, prescribing a molten metal punishment in his Raptus statutes. This law dealt with the abduction of a female slave by a man, sometimes with the assistance of a nurse. If the man was convicted, he was to be burned at the stake. If the slave tried to escape with them, she was burned too. But if the nurse, whose sworn duty was to protect the slave, had been found to have been complicit, she faced a fate arguably worse than burning. Molten lead was to be poured down her throat. The statue itself is chillingly specific. These nurses, first of all, whose service has been proven to have been hateful and whose talk has been proven to have been bought, this punishment shall threaten, that the opening of their mouth and of their throat, which brought forth destructive encouragements, shall be closed by the swallowing of molten lead. It was a rare punishment, save for crimes considered a deep betrayal of trust. Yet another case surfaced in 1599 involving a Spanish governor in Ecuador, who, due to his insatiable greed, was also executed symbolically with molten gold. The report from the time noted that his internal organs burst as soon as he swallowed the gold, a detail later confirmed by modern thermal physics.
We've covered the architect of agony and the price of betrayal, but the horrors only deepen as we move further east. Get ready, because what the ancient Persians devised makes the brazen bull look like a minor inconvenience. The boats, scaphism. The word scaphism comes from the Greek word for boat. It sounds serene, doesn't it? The boats, a nice sail into the afterlife. It was anything but. Our sole account of this unbelievably grotesque Persian execution comes not from the perpetrators, but from the Greek historian Plutarch, writing about his long-standing enemies. For this reason, some scholars debate if it was a genuine execution or merely a piece of vicious propaganda designed to paint the ancient Persians as inhumanely cruel. But the sheer detail of the account is enough to make you physically ill. Plutarch documented this atrocity in his work Life of Artaxerxes, detailing the fate of a soldier named Mithridates. Mithridates had committed a terrible crime, taking credit for the death of King Artaxerxes' rival brother, Cyrus. Even though the king had showered him with gifts and told him to keep the true killer's identity a secret, Mithridates, fueled by wine and arrogance at a banquet, boasted, "I declare to you explicitly that this hand was the death of Cyrus." The king, enraged by this insolence and ingratitude, ordered an execution that would be the most excruciating imaginable. Mithridates was placed between two boats, one inverted and placed over the other. His head, arms, and legs were left protruding through strategically cut holes. In effect, he was sealed into a wooden floating coffin, unable to move. The true torture began now. Force feeding. Mithridates was force-fed until he was bloated and sick. If he refused the food, the executioners would prick his eyes to compel him to eat. Milk and honey. They didn't stop at solid food. Milk and honey were poured not only into his mouth, but all over his face. The weight. He was then left to float under the relentless sun. The combination of the force feeding and the milk and honey covering him soon led to the inevitable. His excrement and vomit covered his body within the enclosed space, attracting swarms of flies and other insects. Plutarch's description of the final stage is unforgettable. Creeping things and vermin spring out of the corruption and rottenness of the excrement, and these entering into the bowels of him, his body is consumed. The victim's flesh would be devoured, and once the top boat was removed, his internal organs would be found swarming with the creatures that had effectively eaten him from the outside in, and possibly the inside out. Mithridates reportedly endured this for 17 days before he finally died. Whether the insects truly devoured his insides is debatable. He would have died from exposure, sepsis, or dehydration long before a full internal consumption. But the deliberate, drawn-out horror of the process is undeniable.
It was a calculated decomposition, a forced, agonizing rot in life. The executioner's art, lingxi, death by 1,000 cuts. The Chinese history of capital punishment is a shocking testament to human ingenuity in inflicting pain, rivaling and perhaps exceeding the cruelty of their European counterparts. You've heard the name, but the reality of lingxi, or death by 1,000 cuts, also known as slow slicing, is even more disturbing. While the 1,000 was usually a hyperbolic number, this was a common, brutal form of execution across China for centuries, with the final documented cases occurring as late as the 20th century. The horror of lingxi was its deliberate pace. It was literally known as the lingering death. The executioner's ultimate goal was not just to kill, but to prolong the conscious suffering of the victim for as long as possible. The condemned's only hope for a quick end was often a hefty bribe to the executioner, either for a faster, lethal cut or a dose of opium to dull the pain. The process itself was an absolute desecration of the human form. The operation would often begin with the removal of thick, non-lethal chunks of flesh from the arms and chest. The slicing would proceed down the body, removing muscle and tissue. The final fatal blows were often the hacking off of the limbs and the head, which had a spiritual purpose, ensuring the body was incomplete and the person would be eternally mutilated, thus making the afterlife less pleasant. While the procedure typically lasted around 15 minutes, there are appalling reports suggesting that some executions were purposefully dragged out to the point where as many as 3,000 small cuts were administered before death finally claimed the victim. The 5 punishments and the saw. But even lingxi wasn't the worst they had. Things got more extreme. To understand the true peak of ancient Chinese cruelty, we must look at the fate of a brilliant man, Li Si. Born around 280 BC, Li Si was a highly respected scholar and politician during the Qin dynasty, famous for his philosophical writings and political acumen, rising to become the chancellor, a kind of prime minister. He was a visionary who advocated for one world comprising all Chinese, bringing with universal dominion, universal peace. But political life is a viper's nest. Following the death of an emperor, Li Si was betrayed by a rival politician named Zhao Gao. Li Si was subjected to a battery of torture to extract information, culminating in a sequence of atrocities known as the 5 punishments. This system was ancient China's ultimate penal atrocity, so severe that it made fighting a monkey in a drowning sack seem merciful. The 5 punishments were a progressive scale of mutilation: tattooing the face, the least severe, a permanent brand of shame; nose removal, a public mutilation ensuring everyone knew the crime; foot or kneecap removal, crippling the victim's mobility; castration, the removal of the penis and testicles, often transforming the man into an eunuch; and da pi, the great punishment, which could take several forms: fendu wei lu, cutting the body into 4 pieces; peng, boiling alive; or qilie, being torn apart by chariots. For a man of Li Si's stature, the penalty was a brutal escalation. He was reportedly subjected to the full, agonizing sequence. First, his nose was removed, then his manhood was taken, and after all that, he was sawn in half. This final act was often performed slowly in the market square for maximum public horror. And the horror didn't stop with him. Li Si was also condemned to familial extermination, a rule during the Qin dynasty that required the execution of 3 clans, essentially 3 generations of the criminal's family. As he faced the executioner's saw, Li Si's recorded final words to his son paint a picture of heartbreaking, simple longing. "I wish that you and I could take our brown dog and go out through the eastern gate of Shanghai to chase the crafty hare. But how could we do that?" This family annihilation was even the fate of Shan Yang, a great lawmaker who championed equality before the courts. His progressive ideas infuriated the nobility. When they finally cornered him, he was tied to chariots and ripped to pieces, an execution he may have even written into the law himself, and his entire family was subsequently executed. And while boiling alive was one of the Da Pi options, it was a horror all of its own, used worldwide to terrifying effect. You may not want to imagine the scene, but in our next section, we'll dive into the story of a Japanese Robin Hood boiled alive with his family and a look at the Roman spectacle that turned a death sentence into mass entertainment. You've seen how greed was punished with gold and betrayal with insects. But what happens when execution becomes a spectacle sport, and what is the darkest secret buried in the Viking sagas? When we return, we uncover the chilling reality of being stomped on by an elephant fitted with blades and the unbelievable visceral horror of the blood eagle.
We just left off on the horrifying note of boiling alive, a method of execution so brutal it literally caused women in the audience to feel sick. But let's delve deeper into this scorching method before we move on to something even more visceral. Death in the kettle. Boiling alive. This method was used by various cultures, but the Japanese in particular utilized it to great dramatic effect. One of the most famous victims was Ishikawa Goemon, a 16th century bandit often celebrated as Japan's answer to Robin Hood. He was a folk hero who stole from the wealthy and redistributed his spoils to the poor, embodying resistance against the corrupt establishment. Naturally, those in power wanted to make a gruesome example of him after he attempted to assassinate key officials. The prevailing legend holds that Goemon was boiled alive in a massive iron kettle alongside his young son. The story goes that in a final act of paternal heroism, he held his son above his head until the child was saved from the fate, only for Goemon to sink to his death. A more historically credible, though equally heartbreaking variation suggests that his entire family, not just his son, was thrown into the searing water and killed. Regardless of the specifics, the outcome was lethally swift and excruciatingly painful. If you are immersed in boiling water, your organs cook almost instantly, causing catastrophic damage and shock. But before that inevitable end, the pain would be unimaginable, amplified for the crowds watching the spectacle. In England, during the reign of King Henry VIII, boiling alive was briefly introduced as the mandatory form of capital punishment for poisoners. Henry, constantly fearing plots against his life, sought to make this offense the most detestable of crimes, requiring the most fearsome deterrent. A contemporary witness recorded the execution of a poisoner who was tossed into the water, noting that he roared mighty loud, and women who were big with child did feel sick at the sight of what they saw. Just months later, a maid who poisoned her employer was executed the same way. In 1542, Margaret Davy met the same fate for a similar crime. Though history books of the era praised the punishment for such a detestable offense, the sheer savagery of her death sparked widespread public horror, with many questioning her guilt and the appropriateness of the sentence. Across Europe, in places like France and Germany, boiling alive was a common punishment not for murder but for clipping, the crime of scraping small bits of precious metal off coins to melt down and forge new ones. This offense against the currency was considered treasonous. This brutal method was chosen precisely because it was designed to inflict extreme, drawn-out pain before death, in contrast to the relatively swift end delivered by a clean beheading. Death by the beast. Damnatio ad bestias. Now, let's talk about the Romans again. As demented as their legal system was, their flair for entertainment elevated cruelty to an art form. Imagine this choice. Would you rather be slowly boiled alive or face a frenzied wild animal? The Romans provided both, and the latter was known as damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to beasts. This was not just a means of execution, it was a massively popular form of public entertainment, horrifying to some Roman intellectuals, but a sensation for the masses crammed into the arenas. Crucially, this was not the glorious gladiator combat you see in the movies. This was a death sentence where the condemned could not possibly win. That's why it fell under the damnatio category. Even if the victim miraculously managed to overpower a lion, a bear, or even an elephant with their bare hands, another beast or a swordsman would instantly appear to finish the job. Within this category, there was an even more egregious subtype, obiscere bestias, being thrown to the beasts. In this case, the victims weren't even allowed to fight back. They were simply tossed to the animals while chained. Or, in a favorite Roman spectacle, an elephant was made to sit on them. This wasn't restricted to criminals.
Historical records detail instances where defeated armies are mutineers or subjected to this fate. One Roman writer recalled a general who, before the eyes of the entire army, he threw them to the elephants. All were trampled to death beneath the feet of the beasts. The use of elephants as executioners was widespread, extending to India, Sri Lanka, and Siam, modern-day Thailand. In Thailand, the technique was chillingly known as elephant soccer, where the trained beasts would kick the condemned around like a ball until they were crushed or mangled to death. A European traveler returning from India described an even more precise horror. A man was forced to lay his head on a block, and the mahout, elephant trainer, then commanded the elephant to deliberately step on the man's head, crushing it in a single devastating moment. But the worst version was described by a Moroccan traveler who met an Indian emperor fond of this gruesome sport. This emperor, in an effort to make the show even more thrilling, had his elephants fitted with custom-made weapons. The traveler wrote, "They were ordered accordingly to be thrown to the elephants, which had been taught to cut their victims to pieces. Their hooves were cased in sharp iron instruments, and the extremities of these were like knives." Imagine the terror. A giant animal, trained to stomp and kick, now has razor-sharp blades on his feet, turning the victim into nothing more than shredded meat. It's a level of premeditated, mechanized violence that is truly beyond comprehension.
We've seen the calculated cruelty of emperors and the spectator sport of the arenas. Now, we turn to the chilling sagas of the North and a unique invention of torture that seems too barbaric to be true: the blood eagle, a Viking horror. Out of all the punishments we've discussed, this one might be the most visually shocking and the most debated by scholars: the blood eagle. It is a form of execution that seems to belong exclusively to the Vikings, appearing in their ancient texts. Picture this scene in 9th century England. You are a king. Weary of the incessant, brutal Viking raids, you make a treaty, a pact, perhaps over a cup of mead. But you break your word and murder a group of Vikings who trusted you. What do you think the retribution will be when their comrades finally capture you? The Vikings, according to the ancient sagas, might not have opted for a simple beheading. No, they would take you to a ceremonial block, not to sever your neck, but to begin an agonizing process on your back. The process, according to the terrifying accounts, went like this. A cut was made down your back. Your ribs were then severed from the spine all the way down to the loins. The ribs, now detached, were pulled outward, giving the horrifying skeletal impression of wings. Finally, your lungs were pulled out through the open ribcage and stretched over these bony wings. Voila! You were now an eagle, a spectacle of bloody, agonizing death, just like in that famous TV show Vikings. But did this actually happen? The historical consensus is shaky. While no archaeological evidence, no remains bearing this specific trauma, has been found, modern scholars agree that it is plausible. It wasn't written into law, but it was repeatedly recounted in sagas, suggesting it was a spectacular form of revenge designed to humiliate and terrorize enemies. One old text chillingly describes the execution of a local ruler, Halfdan, by the Viking Earl Einar. Earl Einar went up to Halfdan and cut the blood eagle on his back, in this fashion that he thrust his sword into his chest by the backbone and severed all the ribs down to the loins, and then pulled out the lungs. And that was Halfdan's death. Another famous instance involves the legendary Viking warrior Ivar the Boneless, who sought revenge on King Alla of Northumbria for the death of his father. The saga, Tale of Ragnar's Sons, records, they caused the blood eagle to be carved on the back of Alla, and they cut away all of the ribs from the spine, and then they ripped out his lungs. A researcher recently noted that while the procedure could certainly be performed with the right tools, there's no possibility that a victim would have remained alive throughout the procedure. The massive blood loss, trauma, and puncture of the lungs would cause death long before the ribs could be completely articulated into the wing shape. So while the victim wouldn't have consciously seen the finished eagle, the pain would have been instant and fatal. In the Viking worldview, these violent acts, which scholars call conspicuous mutilation, were highly symbolic. They weren't just killing an enemy, they were creating a statement, a blood-soaked warning to the world. The Low Countries' low blow, rat torture. If you had to choose a way to die from this entire list, we can guarantee that almost no one watching would pick this final method. It's psychological, visceral, and utterly revolting. It is simply known as rat torture. Rats and humans have always shared space, particularly in the grim, cramped conditions of medieval cities. In 16th century London, the Tower of London allegedly housed a dungeon of the rats. Prisoners in the deepest, lowest cells were subjected to the rising waters of the Thames, which brought in rats. Documents suggest that the vermin, driven by desperation and hunger, would sometimes chew flesh from the arms and legs of the trapped prisoners. But this was hardly death by rat, unless you died later from a massive infection. The true horror of rat torture was invented by the Dutch military leader Diederik Sonoy during the 80 Years' War in the 16th and 17th centuries. Sonoy, looking for a truly unique and terrifying way to extract information from his enemies, got creative with the common pest. The technique was simple in its conception, but devastating in its execution. The victim was laid down, often on a table or board. A large clay pot, heavy ceramic bowl or metal cage containing several hungry rats was placed onto the victim's bare torso or stomach. The container was heated from the outside, often with a torch or hot coals. The heat would drive the confined rats into a frenzy. Desperate to escape the searing container, the only path available was to bore down. The rats, panicking and seeking coolness, would begin to tunnel through the victim's flesh and organs, driven by the need to escape the unbearable heat. The process would be agonizingly slow as the rodents chewed their way through muscle, fat, and bone, burrowing deep into the abdominal cavity. The goal wasn't just to kill the victim, but to inflict a grotesque internal destruction that was almost guaranteed to break the will of anyone subjected to it. The sheer psychological terror of feeling multiple creatures gnawing their way into your body, coupled with the inevitable horrific pain, made this an incredibly effective and feared form of torture. This is the ultimate sickening conclusion to our journey through history's most creative and disturbing forms of death. From the melodic screams of the brazen bull to the terrifying silence of the rat dungeon, these methods reveal a dark truth about humanity. When the goal is punishment, the depths of depravity know no bounds.